Hello, everyone. I'm Gary Locke. I'm the host of this seminar sponsored by the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics. We're really fortunate to have several great speakers with us today, but I also want to acknowledge our student who's helping out, Jacob Schwartz, who's a senior in the School of Public Affairs, and he hails from Philadelphia. And he'll be fielding your questions to our panelists as we get going. So if you have any questions, start entering those into the chat room, and Jacob will be fielding them. We have two great speakers with us. First of all, my good friend and a person I've just come to admire over all these many, many years, Jerry Yang, who co-founded Yahoo in 1995 and is now co-founder of AME Cloud Ventures, which is an innovation investment firm. And he's also the incoming chair of Stanford University on the board of trustees. We also have with us Susan Lund, who's a partner of McKinsey and Company, and she really heads up the McKinsey Global Institute, focusing on the intersection of technology, labor markets, and globalization. And she also has a connection with Stanford, having got her PhD from Stanford in economics. The last few sessions that we've had, we first started off talking about China and the impact of China to global markets and certainly jobs in the United States. Last week, we focused on the whole notion of globalization and what it really means for local companies and the benefits and the drawbacks and some of the downsides of trade. Whether it's what the impact on jobs in America and what it means for the global economy and the standard of living for people all around the world. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's happening in terms of jobs in our communities, especially in this global environment, and especially with the impact of artificial intelligence. I was really struck by a report that McKinsey put out several years ago that said that by the year 2030, 5 to 10% of the world's workforce will be displaced due to AI and robotics. Now that's 5 to 10% of the global workforce, but we know that's probably not going to impact, that is, technology will have very little impact, let's say, on the jobs in Myanmar, Vietnam, or the Congo and other parts of the world. So is that 5 to 10% displacement worldwide going to be really concentrated in the advanced industrialized nations, whether Korea, China, Canada, EU, the United States? So does that mean for us by the year 2030, maybe it's 7, 8 to maybe 12 or 13% of the jobs in America will be displaced, disrupted, gone? And we're talking about today's 47, 48-year-old worker, maybe in 2030, when they're 58, 57 years old, suddenly without a job. And are we saying, go back to school and take a job in coding or take a course in coding? So will you have a job? Whatever you're studying for at American University, will you have a job 10, 15 years from now? I certainly think that when I go to a Starbucks store, maybe 10 years from now, due to maybe facial recognition, it'll say, "Good morning, Gary. Do you want your usual grande mocha with soy milk, extra hot?" And I can walk out without even presenting my Starbucks card or a Visa card or whatever, and just like the Amazon Go stores of today. Will there even be checkers in supermarkets? What will there be truck drivers, Amazon delivery people? What about repairing our automobiles, or even in the banking insurance industry? So that's what we're going to talk about today: the impact of AI and what the policy implications will be for business leaders, policymakers, members of Congress, governors, state legislatures, and even education institutes. But let's talk. Let's hear from Jerry Yang. I mean, he and his company Yahoo, and his colleagues in technology have really changed our lives. If you just think back of what we were doing 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whether it's Alexa and everything else, boy, our lives have really changed. So, Jerry, why don't you tell us a little bit about your kind of prediction about the future of what life will be 10 years from now, and what do you think? What are the key changes in technology that we might be able to expect?
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, you have so many titles, Gary. I'm not sure which one to go by, but thank you for your leadership and all your service to our country. And I'm fortunate that you called me a friend, but you're really one of our leaders of our community, and I want to thank you for this. And I am one of the luckiest people that your students will ever talk to or meet. As you said, I was lucky enough to start Yahoo, but before that, I'm an immigrant, first generation. I came over to the United States when I was 10. I grew up in San Jose, California, and attended public high school, and I was lucky enough to go to Stanford as an undergrad. And the American dream is something that I think people talk about in concept, but in many ways I have been able to take advantage of the great system here in the United States and being an entrepreneur. Not only did I see the first wave of the internet in 1995, which I think most of your students weren't even born yet, I was lucky enough to witness and be part of some of the global internet rises as an early investor in Alibaba, for example. And then as you allude to, we don't need AI to be out of jobs. I left Yahoo in 2012, so I had to go reinvent myself. And that's when I started Ame Cloud Ventures. I missed being with entrepreneurs and being with people with new ideas and game-changing ideas. And over the last 8 years, I've been fortunate enough to play on the theme of being the luckiest guys you guys ever met, to be involved in some great companies, including Zoom. I was one of the early investors in Zoom. So, I think it's better to be lucky than good, but many times you have to work hard to be lucky. So, so I have seen the trends, and it's not surprising, Gary, that many people have asked, what is the prediction for the future? And I will tell you, almost every time, in fact, maybe every time, I've been wrong about predicting the future of technology. So when you look at 2030, it's less than a decade away. But I've been wrong in the past, not because of the direction or the trend, but it's really because of timing. So I would say there's a few things I would add for your students to discuss, and it's such an important topic, the role of technology and the role of AI. The first is that big dislocations, big disturbances in our ecosystem creates the adoption. And I think Susan's report, and Susan will talk about this later, the pandemic, the COVID has become that accelerant in many ways that would have otherwise taken many years or decades to adopt, around digitization, around payments, around automation, and around work habits and collaboration. So that's number one, is it takes sort of shocks in the system to create accelerants, and accelerants the other way. And it may not be pandemics or wars. It could be the hitting the critical mass of network effects. So we, in our generation, we have seen things like social media and e-commerce, and some other trends. So that's one thing. Is prediction is hard because you don't know when these big exogenous events or critical mass events can happen. The second thing is that we are coming into the decade of the convergence of cloud, of internet devices, IoT, of automation, and of software and AI. And why this is important to me is along three folds. When we started Yahoo in the mid 90s, there were maybe less than 100 million people in the whole world use the internet. Today, it is second nature. And and back in 25 years ago, we were dreamers and entrepreneurs and thinking maybe someday we'll be mainstream. But today, I think digital is mainstream. If you're a big company, or if you're a government, or if you're in a um, education or whatever, you have to use technology. So in many ways, the dream of becoming mainstream is being realized and has been realized. And the things that I think come with technology innovation now also comes with its corresponding social, ethical, philosophical, policy implications. And so let me talk about a couple that I think relates to AI as we think about 10 years from now. So you can think about a future where sensors and clouds are integrated, bandwidth is a commodity. We don't worry about glitches in Zoom anymore. We may even be watching ourselves in 3D. And automation, the world that you talked about, is certainly entirely possible. Even in my current portfolio today, we have automated delivery. We have we had a failed effort around an automated restaurant. You go in, you pick it out of a cubicle. We have automated cherry pickers and fruit pickers. And we certainly have tremendous automation in manufacturing and shipping and logistics. So these things, even today as startups will undoubtedly mature in 10 years. But what are the implications about jobs? And I think one of the key questions is there's undoubtedly sort of ongoing displacement, and we've seen some of this in China. For example, China went from a very labor-oriented market to advanced manufacturing, and in the meantime displaced a lot of jobs. So there are a lot of thinking that needs to be done around that. There is a lot of, for example, at Stanford, we have an institute on human artificial intelligence, HAI, picking human at the center and building AI around it. One of the efforts is the future of work. And I think people are thinking about things like retraining and rejob, but also things like universal basic income, or conditional universal basic income. Under what conditions, under what economic conditions do basic income become sensible? And it's not viewed as necessarily a progressive or liberal point of view. It's really just, if automation reaches a certain point to advance societies, the role of work is going to get redefined. So people have to start thinking about that. What are the AI implications for social equity or inequities? I think you have a world where people who have access to technology, people who have access to bandwidth, people who have access to algorithms and data can speed up their learning, speed up their ability to do work, speed up their creativity. And people who don't, whether it's in the same town or the same country or in the same part of the world, you're going to have this inequity. And how does that get addressed as the future goes on? So there has to be a study about inequity or equity being produced by AI. And the third is the data itself. As you well know, garbage in, garbage out. If you put good data in, the algorithm will crank it out, and it'll get good recommendations or good suggestions, everything from your movie to your shopping list. But what about social work, like insurance, giving insurance to somebody or not, or rating your credit rating or not, or in the future in criminal justice, do you keep the person in jail or not? And so I think we have not really fully understood the biases that we put into our data systems. And once we put them in, the systems will do their job, but it will be amplified. And we have to be very vigilant and really be careful about understanding and constantly being vigilant about the quality of the data and whether it reflects our society. And the last thing I'll say is AI as it relates to sort of sovereignty, our ways of life, our governance, and our security. It is certainly in the next 10 years that the intelligence community is already being rewritten based on AI. Whether it's everything from intelligence or surveillance to solar flare and hacking. These are all things that I think is going to be part of the world. But really, I think the bigger question is, as AI, our systems and sensors and ways in which we feel the real world become ways we want to govern, we want to live with each other, we want to associate with each other, whether it's privacy laws, whether it's surveillance laws, whether it's ability to act on data, that gets defined by our way of governance. So you could take Western democracies as a way of life that people may have to define our AI and how our algorithms behave. And then you may have places like China or other places where they may have a different way of governing their population. And these will all be amplified and encoded with their AI. And so I think if you look at the next 10 years, as an entrepreneur and technologist, I would say to your students, there is clearly a technology angle. We still need tremendous amount of innovation, tremendous amount of adaptation, but at the very same time, the policy questions, the economic questions, the ethics questions, and what this means for us to be civil societies is also front and center. And no one can lead without the other, and no one can fall behind, because if we're missing one of these pieces, the consequences are very, very big. So maybe at that, I'll turn it back to you and we can have a conversation. You're on mute, Gary.
Forgot about that. I know our time is limited. So quickly, what type of jobs, what sectors do you think will be most disrupted by AI and technology over the next 10 years?
Well, I think, Susan's presentation later will shine some light on it. But I think that we are, there are sort of the classic perceptions of, we were talking about this yesterday. If you're a radiologist and today you look at X-rays and MRIs, and tomorrow, there are plenty of AI startups that are using machine learning and pattern recognition and image recognition to look at films or MRIs or X-rays, and will radiologists or techs be displaced? And that's an argument that I think some people say, well, look, you have airline pilots and they have autopilot mode, and you still need pilots because you're doing sort of the highest value, most mission critical value stuff. But I would say that there's going to be a layer of stuff that just will go away, meaning do we need people to read forms or write forms out for insurance claims or taxes, or some people are still dealing with sort of very menial kind of things that can automatically process. But I think our belief, or at least my belief, is that the higher value, the sort of critical judgment, the mission critical stuff will tend to have a human decision loop, and I think that may mean fewer humans doing the same jobs. It may mean that we need to have more, we can handle more volume. So as the demand rises, the supply of jobs may stay the same, go higher, or may be more productive. And those are three dimensions that I think we can't predict. I do think automation. Look, the pandemic has forced people to think about contactless, physical environments, right? So, the adaptation of electronic payment rather than cash, or being able to deposit a check without ever going to the bank, or these are things that I think may stick around. You probably need fewer bank tellers. I don't know that. I I'm not offending anybody, but I feel like, that's not a job that, you probably have to go figure out and do something else. At the same time, we're going to need more people who understand data, who can manipulate data. And the tools that you can understand, manipulate data won't require you to become a data scientist to do so. So understanding the nature of data and how to really ask the right questions to get the right answers, those jobs will be on the rise. And lastly, Gary, I think, if you think about farming and you think about manufacturing and you think about sort of the more physical sides, obviously the service sector, whether it's healthcare or restaurants or sort of service, those will probably still be very physical and or even that you can use tools, but you're going to be still in physical contact with people. But you're also going to see a layer of automation threaded throughout. So I don't think there will be no jobs. I don't think there will be. I don't think automation by definition is bad because it takes away jobs. Because what we've seen over 200 years is through productivity growth and productivity improvements, you have this massive growth which supports even more jobs. And what we don't know is how those lines cross right now. And I think the reality, and I take this sort of as a technologist point of view, is like, if we don't do it, somebody else will do it. And if their economies become much more productive, their economy much more efficient, then we would say, why didn't we do that, right?
Well, you're right. It raises a whole bunch of social issues, and for policymakers and people involved in ethics. Alan Mulally, former head of the Boeing company, who then went up to head up Ford Motor Company, said that in the last 15 years, I believe, it takes 40% fewer workers to make the same number of cars out of Detroit. And certainly in the timber industry, we don't need as many people cutting down the trees, because you actually have one person that's kind of operating almost like a bulldozer that grabs the tree, cuts the tree, and then puts it down and hauls it away. Instead of needing 5-10 people to do that same thing, it's only one person. So I think we have a question from the audience or from the students. And so Jake, you want to bring on that question?
Sure. Thank you again, Mr. Yang, for joining us today, and you, Governor, for hosting this event. The first question is from Henry, and it says, what recommendations do you have for young investors in AI or other related industries that will have meaningful impacts on our lives in 2030 and beyond? So I guess any quick investment advice in emerging markets, if you have any.
Look, if I knew, I would be doing it. I think the best investment advice somebody gave me is, there has to be this weird dynamic, which is when the entrepreneur wants to do it, whatever idea it is, and it could be an AI, and there's plenty of it, that at the moment of founding a company or a moment of building his company or her company, people think that the entrepreneur is crazy. And, it happened to me at Yahoo, but it happens to every great entrepreneur. It's like, why the hell would you go do that? Because if it's a great idea that everybody thinks is obvious, then somebody else is probably doing it. And then the weird dynamic is, once you do it, everybody goes, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? So there's this dynamic, there's this window of opportunity of thinking the entrepreneur being crazy to being blindingly obvious. That's your investment window. Now, it's a hit and miss, because if you hit it, you can build companies like Zoom. And I would just say Zoom as an example. I invested in Zoom when Eric Yuan, the founder, was just getting started. And he was one of 5-10 video conferencing solutions out in the market. It's like, why does the world need another video conferencing solution? You had Skype, you had Google Hangouts, you had WebEx, and you had all these other things. And now in 2021, in hindsight, you go, wow, everybody's using Zoom because it just works better, because he has that secret sauce. So I think you have to find that unique value proposition of knowing that entrepreneur is going to survive the impossible phase into the obvious phase.
Another question, Jake? Any other questions?
Sure. If you have time for one more, Mr. Yang. Here's one. Do you predict that the gradual $15 minimum wage hike that is being debated in the Senate today would push corporations towards automation at a faster pace than they're already at? Do you think that plays a role?
That's a great question. I think I think that it really depends on the industry and depends on the part of the country you're from. I think if you live in places like the Bay Area where I am, or places that are very expensive, you could even argue $15 an hour does not pay for what the person needs to live on. And I don't know in other parts of the world and parts of the country, but what I do believe is that I think automation is going to go at a rising pace. It's non-linear, like I said earlier. It's going to be based on bumps and shocks, and whether the federal minimum wage will create a shock enough to change the trajectory, it's hard to say. But I think if you talk to CEOs, if you talk to CEOs that employ millions of people, I think they will probably say, well, it's gonna factor into our decision, because it's an increasing enough of an expense for them to have to continue to think about alternatives. The other issue is it's 15 now, and I think it was $6 when I was young, right? So there's going to be this question of, does rising wages imply inflation? Does rising wages imply other macroeconomic things, which I think this is a question for the economists. But what we've seen is technology has been sort of the productivity increaser in the background that has dampened inflation over the last 2 decades, right? I mean, why hasn't, with all the printing of money and the debt rise, why haven't we seen real prices go up? And I think those are the question, is that technology has been a counterbalance to a lot of these things, but it is a balance. We can't assume one thing or the other, because if it goes out of whack, then it's going to kill the economy.
Great. Well, that brings us to the hard stop that Jerry has, and so really, Jerry, thank you.
But this was a late invite, and I'm glad I was able to do it, and I hope to serve the purpose.
Great. Always great hearing from you, and keep up the great work. All right.
Thanks, guys. Good luck. Yep.
All right. Now it's our pleasure to turn it over to Susan Lund. As I indicated, she's with a partner of McKinsey Company, and she really is a leader of the McKinsey Global Institute, which really is looking at the intersection of technology, labor markets, and globalization. And so I think Susan has recently focused on the impacts of the coronavirus and whether or not it's accelerating the disruptive impact of technology, certainly in America, and has some really sobering, I think, findings and conclusions that all of us need to pay attention to, whether you're a student, whether you're an educator, whether you're head of a company or a policymaker, whether it's in the Congress or in the state legislatures. So Susan, take it away.
Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. It was a delight to hear from Jerry Yang, very special. And I'm going to really reinforce a lot of what he talked about. So as Governor Locke has noted, we've been looking at the future of work and how automation and AI will transform work and the workforce for 5 years now. Just last week, we released a report, What has COVID done to all of this? We started the work last May. And really, when we started it, I wasn't sure what we were going to find. I didn't know if the pandemic would, in fact, slow down use of technology and automation as companies cut investment. I didn't know if it would mean the end of a reduction in the gig economy as companies wanted more control over a permanent workforce. And so I'm going to share with you what we found today. We did a global study, as we do. We looked at 8 different countries, and that includes US as well as 4 countries in Europe and China, India, and Japan, to give us a good mix of different types of global economies. And in each, we looked at how COVID will impact labor demand, the mix of occupations that will be available, and the workforce skills required. So one of the key things about the pandemic is that it made us very aware of the physical attributes of a job. So before this, we thought about were tasks routine or not, and what role will technology play. But suddenly the pandemic shut down businesses and entire industries based on were they essential or not, and what were the physical attributes of those places of work. And so we created a metric to look at. We measured literally the physical closeness involved in a job to other people, the frequency of interactions with other people, and whether you were exposed to many different individuals, like say someone collecting tickets in a movie theater, or whether you were exposed to the same small set of individuals repeatedly, whether your work was indoors and whether it was site dependent. And once we had classified 800 different occupations this way, we then used a clustering algorithm to create 4 different, what we call work arenas. So these are sort of the physical venues where work takes place. For instance, medical care, those would be the doctors and nurses serving patients. You can see them here. And what we found is that in the short term and in the long term, a lot of the disruption is going to be concentrated on 4 specific work arenas. So first is on-site customer interaction. So that would be retail stores, banks, other places where people interact in person. The leisure and travel arena. So this includes restaurants, hotels, hospitality, entertainment venues, as well as airports. Indoor production and warehousing, which is warehouses and factories, as well as things like kitchens in restaurants. So it's where things get made. And then finally can be computer-based office work. So those are jobs like mine where people are primarily working on a computer. Those, when you look at those, and if you think that work is going to be disrupted there, what you'll notice is a lot of those jobs in those venues, particularly on-site customer interaction and leisure and travel, are hourly, low-skill wage jobs. And this is going to be a very different trend than what we saw before the pandemic, that now we've got millions of jobs in food service and restaurants and retail that potentially there won't be demand for. So all of this is because of 3 groups of trends, and Jerry Yang touched on this. The pandemic forced us to try things different ways, both customers as well as businesses. And many of the new behaviors, once we were forced to get used to it, we find are actually efficient and convenient. And so we think that they will persist to some degree. So for instance, work from home. All indications are that it will continue at least in a hybrid form. So people will go to the office a few days a week and then work from home a few days a week. Business travel will decline. My colleagues in travel and logistics say that 20% of business travel will never come back. And that's because of things like Zoom. We found that we can interact over a distance using video conference. Leisure travel, by the way, is projected to come back. And certainly there's talk of even revenge travel. So once we're let loose, there may be a spike in tourism. The second group of trends are related to the digital economy. So e-commerce and virtual transactions. So whether it's restaurant delivery, grocery delivery, telemedicine, online education, streaming entertainment, online fitness, digital payments, all of these types of digital interactions took off. And that's because it's the only way we could interact for the last year. But a lot of the new users who had not used these types of apps and interactions before have now say that they're going to continue to use it. So depending on the platform and the type of interaction, we find that between 50 and 75% of users say they're going to continue to interact this way after the pandemic. And then finally, there has been an uptick in automation and AI. And sometimes this is because companies faced a surge of demand. So for instance, in e-commerce, warehouses, they needed robotics just to keep up with demand. The same is true in grocery manufacturing. So suddenly, because we weren't eating at lunch out and we weren't traveling and having dinners out, people were buying groceries at home, and all the food and beverage manufacturers suddenly had to cope with a huge spike in demand. And the only way they could do that was through robotics and automation. So what this means for jobs of the future, when we take all these trends and we look at what it means, we think that, first of all, we don't try to project the unemployment rate. So by 2030, will people get jobs or not? But what we look at is what jobs will be available. And what we see is that there's a lot of growth in healthcare, in STEM jobs, in managers and creatives. So those are the occupational groups on the left side of this chart. The little orange diamond shows you what we had projected before the pandemic. So you'll see, for instance, in transportation, that's where autonomous vehicles, we thought there would be maybe flat or a few less jobs in transportation in the United States by 2030. But now, because of this delivery economy, that sector is booming. But then on the right side of this chart, you see the jobs that are projected to decline in absolute numbers between now and 2030. So at the bottom, office support jobs. Sorry, this is a percent decline, but the numbers are off to the right. 900,000 fewer jobs in offices. 3 million fewer jobs in customer service and sales. 1.1 fewer million jobs in food service. So this is a very different dynamic looking forward. What we see across countries, and it's very similar in all the countries we model, is that all of the projected job growth is going to be in occupations that are today in the top 30% of the income distribution. And the middle wage jobs and the low wage jobs are flat or declining depending on the country. So what this means is that for public policy, we've got a massive challenge in how do we get people the skills that they're going to need. So across the 8 countries we look at, there are 100 million workers that might need to find a different occupation. And many of those people, the majority of them, are going to be mid-career. So these are people with a family, with a mortgage payment. They can't go back to college or even back to a 2-year college. So the question is going to be, how can we provide short-term training opportunities to get people the credential they need? I thought I'd include a slide for all of you being students. People always ask me, well, what skills do I need to be employable in the future? And what this shows you is, in the US, we see declining demand for the activities that just use physical and manual skills. Big decline in all of the job activities that just require basic literacy, numeracy, and data entry. Those things are very easy to automate. On the other end of the spectrum, we see huge growth in demand for technology skills, and that's both the people who create and deploy the technologies like Jerry Yang, but also just using technologies. Every job has become much more highly technological, so it's important that all of you are adept at using technology. As an economist, I wrote econometrics programs in Fortran when I was at Stanford a million years ago. Then we moved through different iterations of software. So it's important that everybody continue to keep up with their digital skills, because that's changing quite rapidly. And then you'll see huge growth for socio-emotional skills. And this is like managing others and showing empathy and teaching and training. And that's because these are the things that computers and automation don't do very well. Now, in the middle, you'll see this bucket called higher cognitive skills. And as college students, you probably think, well, this is what you're getting. And you might be dismayed to see a potential decline in demand for higher cognitive skills. And that's because that group of skills includes very different types of skills, some of which are declining and some of which are growing. So what's declining is just basic advanced quantitative skills and statistical skills. So jobs in accounting, actuaries, finance. Computers are really, really good at doing calculations. They're also getting good at writing things like news stories, company financial reports, so advanced literacy. We're finding a lot of writing is happening by AI algorithms. But then on the other side, what is growing in those higher cognitive skills are things like critical thinking, synthesizing information, and problem solving. So the challenge for policymakers is going to be to figure out how can we take low-wage hourly people who may have a high school degree or even less and put them on a sustainable career path that leads upwards. And we can do it, but it will take a much more concerted effort than we've seen in the United States. So this page shows you, we just did a quantitative analysis of the overlap in skills. Like, could we take a retail cashier and think up a career path for them to earn more money and advance their skills? And we developed one for sales and management and one for healthcare, where it takes several steps. But this is the kind of thinking we need. Traditionally, what's happened, what we can see in the labor market data, is that people go from one low-wage dead-end job to another. So for instance, from food service to retail to hospitality, and all of those jobs are declining. So the key is going to be helping people move on an upward path. I think that for policymakers, there's a long agenda. First and foremost is expanding the digital infrastructure, because COVID has really accelerated use of digital in our lives, and we still have too many Americans that don't have access to affordable broadband. There are several different recommendations around supporting workers in transition, so that if you need to take 3 months off to reskill for a different job, you should be supported. Potentially expanding benefits for independent workers, that includes self-employed people. One of the really positive things we saw in 2020 was that the number of new business startups was double the average level of all previous years. So people actually took the pandemic as a time to try out a new business idea, and which is quite important. But right now, so much of our healthcare and retirement benefits are linked to being connected with a large employer. So I'm going to pause there. This is a long report. You can download it for free from our website, but would love to take questions and find out what's on your mind.
Susan, there was one of your slides back there that had the big circle about halfway through that showed the impact in America. Could you go back to that and maybe elaborate on that particular slide?
I will. This one. Okay. So in the US, the circle is the percent increase from before the pandemic in the number of people who are going to need to switch occupations. And that's because they're in one of those occupations in the previous chart that we think is going to decline in demand. So it's the surplus people in retail and food service. It's not to say there won't be any jobs there, but they're going to be fewer than there are now. And so those people need to switch. So it's a 28% increase, the most of any country. And that reflects in part the US has many more of those low-wage service jobs than other countries. So in Europe, for instance, they went to self-checkout in retail 20 years ago because of labor laws and different labor costs. For instance, a retail sector in Europe employs only less than half of the number of people in the US.
So is this when you say an increase between pre and post COVID-19? So is that you're saying that in the absolute amount of 17 million, that's 17 million more because of COVID? So, but what is the prediction in terms of the displacement in total by 2030 in the United States?
So it's 17 million people have to change their jobs, and that's up from 15 million before. And this is in what we call our midpoint automation scenario. There is a more rapid automation scenario that we published in our previous work, that if technology was deployed and adopted faster, you'd get up to, at that time it was 54 million American workers needing to be redeployed, and now that figure would go up to 75 million, actually a bit above that. So the point is, it's a bigger challenge, and it's even more urgent because frankly, growth in jobs in retail and food service were a little bit of a safety net. It's a job that somebody who lost their job in manufacturing didn't want to go work necessarily for Walmart, but they could do it. Mm-hmm. And now even that option may not be available. So I think that the pandemic has really raised the importance for your students and for public policy leaders in this country to start grappling with how are we going to provide opportunities for these people to get into an upward career path.
So what is your estimate, taking into account COVID now,
Yeah.
but by the year 2030, what % of the American workforce will be displaced due to AI and technology?
Yeah, I mean, so in the midpoint automation scenario, that's about 15%. But if companies, ramp up even, at the faster level, and some of what Jerry Yang said made it seem like that's possible, then you're talking about up to a third of the U.S. workforce, and that is a huge, huge challenge. And let me say the other thing I think that's important, especially for those of you that end up in the business world, for public policy, what matters is people who need to switch occupations, because that's a huge transition. But for those who go into the business world, all jobs are changing. So what companies are finding is as they reimagine their future workforce, even if they still have accountants and actuaries, right, the nature of the job is changing. So most people need to continuously learn new skills on the job. This idea of lifelong learning is something that's been talked about, but hasn't really been fully embraced, but now it's absolutely critical. And any industry you look at, banking, I mean, so when you look at, so for instance, Goldman Sachs, right now, a third of its workforce are computer engineers. You think Goldman Sachs is a bank or an investment bank, right? It's actually a technology company at this point, right? And you can look at industry after industry and find that even employees who stay with the same company end up being redeployed and learning to do very different things. So I guess one message for all of the students joining us today is this idea of adaptability and flexibility is going to be incredibly important, that you may have several very different jobs or careers over the course of your lifetime.
One of your McKinsey reports talked about the impact of this disruption in terms of population centers and where the jobs will be and what that will do in terms of the urban-rural divide and even within cities. Can you talk a little bit about what will this disruption do to the look and feel of America and where people are going to be living, where the jobs are, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so before the pandemic, we looked over the 10 years from the great financial crisis of 2008 and 9 up to 2018. There was a very clear trend in the US, and we found it in Europe as well, where the largest, most dynamic cities were attracting the people, they were creating the jobs. So in the US, it was 25 cities accounted for 60% of job growth over that decade. And the 25 cities are the ones you would guess, right? Denver and Seattle and San Francisco and LA, Chicago, New York, Boston, Washington, and so on. But what it means is that huge swaths of the rest of the country were either treading water or falling behind. So what we called stable cities like Milwaukee or Detroit or St. Louis were actually sort of keeping their head above water, but not growing much. And then there were huge parts of the country in rural areas that were actively losing people, losing jobs, and emptying out. Now, remote work and working from Zoom, at least in 2020, looks like it may have reversed that trend. And whether it holds as economies reopen and after we're all vaccinated, I think remains to be seen. But there's clear evidence in this report that we just published in terms of both office vacancy rates and residential rents, finding people are moving to the suburbs and even to smaller cities. So LinkedIn gave us data of their members in the US that had switched locations, and you see huge outflows from New York, San Francisco, Boston, and the cities that recorded more LinkedIn members moving in were Madison, Wisconsin, Richmond, Virginia, Charlotte, North Carolina. So it'll be interesting to see. I think it's too soon to say, will that continue? But if it does, I think from a public policy perspective, it's actually quite good because it's spreading prosperity, and it's reducing some of the geographic inequality that's really risen up. And it's, putting more dynamism into lots of places that have struggled.
Mhm. All right, I think we have a few questions from our audience. Jake, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you again, Susan, for joining us today. A question from Jenny. So Governor Locke talked in the beginning about food chains such as Starbucks being humanless by as soon as the end of this decade. Do you think that's a realistic timeline, or will kind of more familiar things like that take more time than just a decade?
I think it could take less than a decade. I mean, I look at just the shift in, how many of you now actually go and order your coffee from a person versus you order it on an app and then you grab it off a shelf. So that is part of the contactless customer economy that's been mentioned earlier, where it's partly convenience, but also now a different sense of health and hygiene. So our experts say, first of all, COVID will never actually be eradicated. It will be endemic in the human population. It'll be out there. And that we should expect other pandemics. So some of our, wearing masks, washing our hands, trying to keep a little bit more physical distance may persist. And so things like automating the customer experience when you go to a Starbucks is something that's also more convenient and people like it.
I mean, right now, you can walk into a grocery store and there are very few live checkers. In some cases, during certain hours, you can only do self-checkout where you're scanning all the items yourself. Next question.
Sure. So a question from Henry. Is there a way to avoid the acceleration of remote learning? And can AI be used to make working together in teams in physical office more productive? So it could actually reverse the trend.
Well, so it's interesting. What companies are thinking about is segmenting what should people do at home versus in the office. So part of what people do is, kind of by yourself on a computer. And if you're doing that, you don't need to be in the office. You don't need to have a desk and an office space or a cubicle or what have you. If you're doing those things, you can do it from home, but there are lots of things you need to do together. So making critical decisions, bringing new people into the organization, problem solving and brainstorming, innovation, coaching and mentoring other people, whether you're being coached or coaching others. So those things will continue to happen with people in an office, but it means that the office will look and feel very different. It will not be a sea of people, think about Dilbert cartoons. I may be dating myself. It's not going to be a sea of cubicles, people sitting alone. It's going to be team rooms and interactive spaces and people working together.
Sure.
So in that way, I think technology, getting back to the original question, I think technology will enable all this. I think one of the things that made the pandemic, I think, less devastating for the economy is the fact that we have tools like Zoom. So I used to spend my life on a lot of conference calls, and I can tell you that being on video conference is just a markedly different experience, and it's a much better experience. So I think technology, the fact that the pandemic hit when it did, if we didn't have all these digital technologies and apps and e-commerce and Zoom, it would have been a lot more devastating.
Okay. And here's a question from Jack from the Naval Academy. So as the demand for socio-emotional skills increases, as you noted in your presentation, how do college students entering the workforce advance their socio-emotional skills and demonstrate their leadership skills to businesses?
Well, it's a great question, and it's something that educators don't really know how to teach, and businesses don't know how to train. And it's, I think, one of the things that's going to be grappled with. But I think as a student, the main way you show socio-emotional skills is often in your non-coursework activities. So whether you're part of a club or doing charitable work, and those are the types of activities to really highlight, to show that you've got leadership potential, that you know how to do teamwork, and of course, just verbal communication skills and writing is going to continue to be a critical part of conveying that you can listen, understand, and communicate with others.
And then I have a question as well. So do you think the recent push for unionization at Amazon and Biden's recent praise of the effort will push Amazon faster towards automation? Do you think humans will still be packing Amazon warehouses by 2030?
Well, I can't speak to Amazon in particular, but I know that the warehousing venues is one of the arenas where you see a lot of robotics and automation taking place. And, you know, so far it's been mainly moving large boxes and shelves around, and there are human pickers packaging boxes, but a lot of the advanced technology are now robotic arms that can grasp an object and tell the difference between a rubber ball and a furry ball, and very, you know, small different types of objects. So it does seem like the warehousing world is one that is being very rapidly transformed. And I don't know, you know, the speed at which that plays out, but I do think that that is an area, because it's a confined, controlled environment that's sort of perfect for robotics, as opposed to messier environments like out on human streets, etc.
So Susan, you talked earlier about, and even Jerry brought up the whole notion of some sort of income. I mean, what do we do when we have so many people with a rising population, fewer jobs? What do we do about preparing people, and whose responsibility is it to prepare people for this disruption? Because until it suddenly hits us, or we're going to say, oh my gosh, I'm still going to be working at company X doing X, Y, and Z. And suddenly, companies automated or installed all these new mechanisms and deployed technology, and suddenly I am out of a job. What should policymakers be thinking about and doing now to prepare for that eventuality of disruption?
Yeah, I think that public policy is definitely required. I would say that it's shared responsibility between businesses, educators, and public policymakers. So many businesses are actually offering their workforce ways to earn college degrees or associate's degrees. So Walmart has a big program called College on $1 a Day, where they want the employee to put in $1 a day, and they have set up partnerships with probably a dozen universities, mainly offering online courses to earn college credits. Starbucks has something similar for its baristas. Amazon is moving in that direction. So a lot of these employers are looking forward to the future and seeing we may not need all these people, are actively providing the tools for their current workforce to try to learn other skills. But that said, when someone, as you point out, is out of a job, then we do need public support. Right now, we have a system in the United States where when someone has been fired and loses their job, then unemployment benefits kick in. But what about somebody who voluntarily wants to go through a 3-month certified nursing assistant training program to get onto a healthcare career track? And we have a critical shortage of nurses, by the way, in this country, right? So why can't that be supported? Mid-career people who have got rent or mortgage and children, you know, can't take time off not working. So I think we do need to be more creative in how we think about when should we support households and workers, and supporting them. And also then, this is where educators come in, right? People won't have the capacity to go back to school for 2 years or 4 years, right? So what we've got to be thinking about is what kind of credentials can you learn to earn to learn a very specific skill that will then get you, you know, into that path into HR or sales or healthcare or the vocational trades like electricians and welders, and making those more broadly available and I think more well known.
Right. I've always thought that unemployment insurance, you know, it's supposed to be a safety net, but it's available only when people have lost their job. Wouldn't it be better if people were able to tap into some of those funds to avoid being laid off or losing their job, and using it, like you said, for some sort of job training? program, because once you're out of a job, then you're struggling to pay rent, get food on the table for the family. That's a hard time to be going back to school.
It is. I completely agree. So in Germany and in much of Europe, they have a program where the government subsidizes employers to keep the worker on their books, precisely so that you aren't let go, you're sitting at home, you're depressed. I mean, all the research shows that being unemployed has really negative implications for your skills, for your emotional health, for your physical health, for the health of your family. It has a long-term impact for many people.
Great. I think we have one last question in the queue. Jake, you want to see if we can quickly?
Sure. This question is from Eric. Do you have any data on how many people use self-service at retail outlets and how that trend has been increasing over time?
I don't know off the top of my head what the actual percentage is, but it's grown, hugely over 2020. So every digital channel, whether it's e-commerce or grocery delivery, self-checkout, 2020 was this disruption, this discontinuity. We had this slow growth in self-checkout, right? And then suddenly, boom, it's up at a new level and it will continue growing from here.
All right, great. Well, I think our time has come to an end, and I promised you, Susan, we would not take up too much of your time, and really a pleasure having you. And maybe we can post on our website, our chats, the references to the reports that you were presenting, and any other reports that you had. I think especially the one pre-COVID about the impact on cities and the clusters around the country that will be formed based on the disruptive impact of AI. But as you said, maybe that's going to be reversed thanks to the technology. People can actually live in many of the remote parts of the world or the United States and still be productive and do work or teach or whatever. And that might actually kind of reverse some of the so-called decay of rural communities, and certainly help sustain them. So with that, anyway, thank you very much, Susan, for a great presentation and your time. Thank you, Jake, for moderating this and helping prepare for this seminar. And best of luck to you as a senior now at American University. And I want to thank Jerry Yang, who kind of led us off with his observations about technology and when companies are going to take off and which ones will succeed and which ones won't. It's all about luck and timing. And anyway, thank you all for joining us today. At our next session, we'll be talking about, can we use business principles to operate government agencies and run government? Should government actually run like a business? And what can we learn from the private sector? With that, thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you, Susan.
I'll send the links to the last two reports. Thanks. Bye.
Very good. Thank you
so much.